Alright, hello everybody, welcome to another video, and today let's talk about subsuming abilities, because, you know, it's kind of nuts. This was one of the things from TennoCon that I was pretty unsure of because we didn't have an awful lot of information as to what we will be able to do with it, and I was pretty sure that, you know, we won't be able to move things like Rhino's Roar, because that would be nuts, right? Yeah, about that. But, before we jump into subsuming, let's talk about the abilities, the current abilities that we know of anyway, that you will be able to get through Helminth if you feed him enough. So we started with Empower, increases the power strength of your next ability. This could be nuts, but it depends on the numbers. Okay, this is going to be especially good if the numbers are good on things like Mesa, because you can pop Empower, then jump into Peacemaker and have a bunch of extra strength throughout the entirety of that. And the same goes for exalted weapons and even things that sustain their duration, like Eternal War, Warcry. Next on the menu we have Energy Munitions. Imbue your weapons with ammo efficiency. This could be good on certain weapons because what ammo efficiency means in Warframe is it basically gives you a chance to not consume ammo. And there are a few weapons that pop into mind with this one, things like the Kakatas, you know, your bullet hoses, where saving ammo is actually gonna be really good and will increase your DPS by a lot, but even things like the Piranha Prime will be really nice if the ammo efficiency is of course high enough to make it worth running. Up next is Infested Mobility, increase your sprint and parkour speed. I don't really see this being used an awful lot depending on the numbers once again, but personally I don't think it's going to be better than like running a normal subsumed ability from another Warframe. Because bear in mind, you can only customize one ability per loadout, okay? So if you use one of these abilities, you cannot then put on an ability from another Warframe as well. Then there is Marked for Death. Stun an enemy, next damage you deal to it will be dealt to all enemies around it. This could be interesting, actually. It depends on how expensive it is. If it's pretty cheap, could be okay with some really strong single target weapons or abilities even. Then there is Rebuild Shields, which is fairly vague. It says instantly restore shields. It doesn't necessarily say that you instantly restore all shields, so once again depends on the numbers, though this could be pretty damn good on Hildrin. After that we have Perspicacity. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Your next hack will be automatic. Why would you do this over another ability? I don't know. We have Companion Heal. Heal your companion and call it to your side. I feel this would be better if it revived the companion, so it would be a way to actually sustain your sentinel. Other than that, probably not worth it. And finally there's Expedite Suffering. Hit enemies in a cone. Affected enemies will have their bleed and toxin status removed and the remaining damage dealt in a burst. I don't necessarily think this is worth it, and that's mainly because even the status damage over time in Warframe is dealt pretty fast, so there is no need to speed it up, I think. So those are all the extra new abilities that you can get from Helminth by feeding him. Now let's talk about the subsumed abilities. Now the way this works is you can sacrifice one of each Warframe to Helminth, and this will allow you to use one predetermined ability from that Warframe and put it onto another Warframe by replacing one of its already existing abilities. And it doesn't matter which one, you can actually replace whatever you want. So, going alphabetically, we have Ash with Shuriken. Shuriken is okay, right? It does a little bit of slash damage, leaves behind a slash proc. The important thing about this is that you can use Seeking Shuriken, which is an augment that allows it to strip armor. And this turns what is simply just an okay ability into one of the cheapest and most reliable ways of stripping away enemy armor. Up next, we have Atlas with Petrify, which simply stuns the enemies in a cone in front of you, but you can also use the Orgaze augment, which then causes the enemies petrified by Petrify to drop extra loot. So you could theoretically double down on loot, because you could petrify with Ivara and then steal from the enemy as well, or you could petrify with the Necros and then desecrate the enemy once you kill them. So if you want to do some mad serious farming, this is something you might want to look into. Up next we have Banshee with Silence, which is kind of nuts. I was expecting Sonic Boom to be here instead, which gives you an aura that will stun enemies around you and it limits their perception. So that's pretty damn nice. And you can also use the Savage Silence augment, which gives you more finished damage while you have Silence. Moving on from there, we have Baruch with Lull, which is a crowd control that slowly puts the enemies to sleep, but they will be woken up by damage. However, you can also use Endless Lullaby, which then spreads lull when you do a finisher on an enemy that's been put to sleep by lull. I don't really see myself using this that much. Next we have Chroma with Elemental Ward. This one is pretty good actually. It does different things based on your energy color. So if you have like reds and oranges, it will do a little bit of heat damage around you and increase your base health. If you have blues, it will increase your base shields by quite a nice amount. and then zap enemies that attack you with a chance to stun them. Then there is green, which in an area around you has a chance to deal a percentage of the enemy's maximum health as toxin damage, and it also increases your reload and holster speed. And finally there is white, which increases your base armor and then reflects damage back to enemies. Then there is Ember with Fire Blast, which allows you to smack the ground, sending out waves of fire which do damage and strip enemy armor, but unfortunately this one is too expensive. The base energy cost is 75, so it's gonna be better to just go with Seeking Shuriken instead, I think. Then there is Equinox, and they decided to go with the Rest and Rage, and the way it's gonna work is if you have bright energy colors, it will use one of them, and if you have dark, it will use the other one. Okay, so there's going to be no switching back and forth. This is going to be pretty impactful because Rest is probably the most convenient and fastest way of putting vast amounts of enemies into sleep. And it will allow essentially any frame to do the crazy affinity farming strategy that Equinox players have been doing since like forever. Up next we have Excalibur with Radial Blind. This is just a really nice stun that opens enemies up to finishers, especially if you then put on Radiant Finish, which is an augment. Frost gives you Ice Wave, which is, that's one of the worst ones, I would say. The same pretty much goes for Gara, because she gives you Spectre Rage. You know, the one that summons the mirrors, the one that's pretty useless on Gara. Yeah, that one. Then there is Garuda with Blood Altar, which is the one that impales an enemy on a spike and then allows you and your allies to heal from it. That's not the worst thing in the world. We have Gauss with Thermal Sunder, and this is like a combo ability. I don't know how useful this is going to be on other frames. You can basically just chill the enemies and then set them on fire, or you can use them in succession and like stun them and stuff. So it's mostly just damage with some additional faff. Then with Grendel we get Nourish, but only like the buff portion, because you know you're not Grendel, so you can't eat anything, so you would just heal a little bit. And then you can either get energy, you can get armor, or you can get toxin damage to your attacks. I'm not entirely sure how this one is going to work. Then from Harrow you can get Condemn, which isn't too bad. That's his first ability that chains enemies down and gives you shields when you chain enemies down. But the Augment Tribunal won't actually do anything, I don't think, because it requires Harrow's other abilities to work. Then with Hildrain you can get Pillage, which is an expanding aura that normally costs shields, but it's going to cost energy on normal frames. And what it does is it cleanses status effects from allies, and enemies in the line of sight of Hildrain will actually have their shields and armor reduced. And you can also press the ability again while it's active, which will sort of draw enemies towards you and restore shields and overshield based on the amount of like armor and shields you stole from the enemies. Moving on from there, we have Hydroid with Tempest Barrage. This is his first ability that can also use Corroding Barrage to strip away enemy armor. I don't think this is going to be that popular, honestly. From Inaros you'll be able to get Desiccation, which is his first ability, you know, his pocket sand that staggers enemies, opens them up to finishers and steals a little bit of their health. And I don't think this is going to be very popular, because the reason this is so good on Inaros is because of his passive, where if he does a finisher and kills an enemy, he restores a percentage of his life. And when he can't do that, it's basically just an okay-ish crowd control ability. Up next we have Ivara with her Quiver. How unexpected, not really. And this will only give you 2 of the arrows. You will get Cloak and Noise. Now Noise is whatever because it just draws enemies in, but Cloak is kind of spicy because it allows you to go invisible with any frame, which is kind of nice. And there is also some shenanigans you can do with companions, because you can shoot your companion with the Cloak arrow and turn them into what is essentially a portable invisibility field. Then there is Korra, which will give you an Snare. This is kind of like a jankier version of Nidus's Larva. It simply draws enemies in, but it's far more fiddly, and like the way it draws enemies in means that they can get stuck much easier than if you use Larva. Limbo will give you Banish, which just no, absolutely not. The Banish on its own is pointless. It's just don't. Okay. Loki will give you Decoy, which is probably one of the worst things you can exhume. Mag will give you Pull, which could be okay. It's not like super good, but if you combo it with Greedy Pull, you can actually collect the loot much nicer. So if you're, I don't know, doing some loot farming on Necros, you can pull loot to yourself, I suppose. Mesa will give you Shooting Gallery, which is the swirly thing that gives you weapon damage and jams the guns of nearby enemies and jumps from team member to team member. And then the Augment is kind of meh, because after 6 kills or assists, you will get a buff that will blind nearby enemies when you shoot. Okay. And then we hit our first maximum spice, Mirage, which gives you Eclipse. Now, just in case you don't know, Eclipse is a weird buff because it either gives you an assload of damage if you're standing in the light, or an arseload of defense if you're standing in the darkness. And it also has the total eclipse augment, which allows you to sort of propagate the buffs from eclipse to nearby allies that are within 15. And it also has an augment called Total Eclipse, which allows you to turn it into essentially an aura that affects allies within 15 meters of you as well. This is also where we run into our first but with the Subsume system, because what they've done is they don't allow you to move damage buffing abilities onto Warframes that already have damage buffing abilities. So yes, you can move Eclipse around, but you can't put it on Rhino that already has Roar. Now, it's not like you can't put Eclipse on Rhino, it's just that if you do want to put Eclipse on Rhino, you have to replace Roar. You can't have both at the same time. Up next, we have Necros with Terrify. I was never a big fan of Terrify because it's a crowd control abilities that makes the enemies run away from you, which is not what you want. Neja will give you Firewalker, which, I mean, is already pretty on Neja, so it's gonna be even more on other frames. Another pretty spicy one is Nidus with Larva, which is just a really good way of like packing enemies into a tight space so you can blow them up very, very easily. So I feel like this one is going to be pretty popular. Then from Nova you can get Null Star, which I think is pretty good because the Null Stars are her first ability, which surround you in antimatter particles, give you damage reduction and then shoot at enemies that get too close, destroying the particle and damaging them. And the reason why I think this is good is because if you build it in a specific way, that is buff your strength and cripple your range, the particles won't actually shoot off all that often. The enemies will have to get really close, and then thanks to all the particles you get from the strength, you will have pretty much capped out damage reduction most of the time. And then the augment lets you detonate the particles, allowing you to essentially reset it as well. Then there is Nyx, which gives you mind control. Why? And then we have Oberon, from whom you can get Smite, which normally is just okay. You bonk the enemy with a little bit of damage, it's pretty cheap. The important thing here is that you can use Smite Infusion and hold the ability down to then get a pretty substantial radiation buff to your weapons. This is going to be awesome for hunting Eidolons. Then from Octavia you get Resonator, which is the Roly Ball Spectre that taunts enemies and is invulnerable. That one's pretty nice if you want some additional like defensive layer, because this one is pretty good. And the augment for it, which is Conductor, just allows you to position it around by using it again. Then from Protea you can get Dispensary, which is actually really nice because there is some shenanigans you can do with it, and Equilibrium, and then the mod that gives your companion armor when you pick up a health orb, which allows you to infinitely pick up health orbs. So this one could potentially be really nice for power hungry frames. Then from Revenant you can get Reeve, that's his dash, which is kind of, I would say, unimportant. It's not going to do an awful lot, and you can also use Blinding Reef to then blind enemies you dash through as well. And now we get onto the big spicy boy, the biggest spice, Rhino. Who gives you Roar? Because of course he does. Now the same but applies to this as with Eclipse, so you can't take Roar and put it onto Mirage that already has Eclipse unless you replace Eclipse with Roar. But that doesn't really matter. You know why? Because it's Roar. It's Roar! You can put Rhino Roar on any Warframe in the game. Who the hell saw that one coming? I was like, well, they're not gonna give us Iron Skin because Iron Skin is too strong. They're sure as hell not giving us Roar because it's Roar, so it's probably gonna be Charge. Nope, just Rhino Roar for everybody. You get a Roar, you get a Roar, you get a Roar. Everybody gets a Roar. This is madness. But anyway, moving on to Siren, who will give you Mold, a nice defensive ability, and you can also use Regenerative Mold to regenerate life. That's kinda cool, I guess. Titania gives you Spellbind, which, I mean, that's okay as well, I suppose. Though it does feel pretty meh compared to having Rhino Roar, doesn't it? And Spellbind, by the way, is just a little bit of crowd control, essentially. It fumbles the enemy, it makes them float around and drop their weapon, and you can use Spellbound Harvest, which, if you hit at least 4 enemies with Spellbind, you will get 50 energy back. Then from Trinity you can get Well of Life, which is her pulsing heal that she can cast onto an enemy, though they did buff the base ability, which apparently now does a small amount of heal over time over a large range. If you hit the enemy, a percentage of the damage dealt is converted into an AoE heal, so that's a nice healing setup there. And then of course you can put on the Pool of Life augment, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, which makes the enemy drop health orbs and also gives it a chance to drop an energy orb. Now following that we have the second big spice, and it is a spicy girl this time around, Valkyr, who gives you Warcry of all things. Yes, This is the best thing about Valkyr. Some people might say it's Hysteria, those people are incorrect. It's Warcry, an insane melee buff that gives you crazy attack speed and armor, and can be made self-sustainable through the Eternal War Augment, which gives you extra duration every time you kill something. I cannot wait to put this on my arrows and then just rufflecopter through missions at supersonic speeds. It's gonna be hilarious. Though now that I think about it, it might be more hilarious to put it on Volt or Gauss. Oh my god, the speed. But anyway, moving on, from Vauban you'll be able to get Tesla Nervos, which are the small rollers that roll around attached to enemies and do a little bit of damage, arcing electricity to enemies in nearby area. And then you have the Tesla Bang Augment, which makes the enemy then sort of like absorb damage and explode with it. From Volt you will get Shock, which on its own is pretty meh, but once you put on Shock Trooper it becomes pretty good because then you can hold the ability down and get a pretty decent electricity buff to your weapon damage. Then from Wisp you will get Breach Surge, which could be good depending on how it works, because what Breach Surge does is it marks the enemies, and whenever you damage them they have a chance to release a damaging projectile. So if this works with things like Spores on Sarin, this could be pretty awesome. Then for Wukong we have Defy, which is now his defensive ability, where he assumes a stance, blocks all damage and then retaliates and gets extra armor from it, so that's a nice bit of defense I suppose. Zaku gives you Zata's Whisper, I have no clue what that does, and finally we have Zephyr, who will give you Air Burst. This one is a bit meh, but it appears to have been buffed, so it now has a hold and tap functionality, so the hold one will blow enemies away, and if you tap it you will be able to suck enemies into a wind vortex. And that is pretty much it for all the subsumed abilities. This is gonna be crazy, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, dudes and dudettes. It's gonna be absolutely nuts, and if you like some of these, which you probably do, right? Roar, Warcry, that kind of stuff, you should definitely go and farm spare Warframes so that you can sacrifice them to Helminth, because if you do sacrifice the Warframe to Helminth to get the subsumed ability, you will lose the Warframe you sacrificed, unsurprisingly. And I think that's enough blabbering for today, so I thank you very much for watching and listening. I hope you have enjoyed the video, and I will see you some other time. Bye bye.